Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today, Developing Better Strategies Through Effective Member Research with Matt Braun. Before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to a few things. Matt has provided a handout that's a great resource for you. You can access the handout by expanding the Handouts section of the control panel and downloading it. Also, questions are encouraged. You can ask your questions by typing them into the chat box. Matt will field as many questions as he can at the conclusion of the presentation. Feel free to post your questions at any time, and we'll get to them towards the end of today's webinar. Now, a little bit about Matt. Matt Braun leads the association's practice at Loyalty Research Center. As Vice President of Client Services, Matt is involved with the sales, development, and execution of research programs for corporate, nonprofit, and membership-based organizations within a variety of industries. His role includes expertise in qualitative research design and execution, quantitative research design, implementation, analysis across all methodologies, and research deployment via reporting and presentation. Within his role, he has also provided thought leadership publications and speaking engagements with the Indiana Society of Association Executives, the American Society of Association Executives, and the Council of Manufacturing Associations. Today, Matt will provide guidance on developing more effective survey methodologies, specifically how to give your members a positive survey experience, create questions that lead to actionable information, and how to get the information and insight you need to develop more effective strategies that enable you to build and grow your association. So thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. The floor is now all yours.
Great. Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar today. Before we dive into the information this afternoon, I'd first like to just look at the title of the webinar today, Developing Better Strategies Through Effective Member Research. For our clients, the word strategy typically means strategic planning, a longer-term, bigger picture plan. Where is the organization today? Where will it be going over the next 3 to 5 years? What will we or should we be doing for our members over that time? And the big question that I've heard most over the last 3 to 5 years is, why will we be relevant to our members 3 to 5 years from now? But strategy can also be near-term and very specific. Strategy can mean focusing on key member experiences like conferences, other events, education, chapters. It could mean focusing on specific member segments, say a generational cohort, or domestic versus international members. It could also mean focusing on external factors like legislation, regulatory issues, competition, both for you as an association as well as your members. So our research and the research that we do for our clients drives key decision points, whether it's near-term and more tactical or long-term and bigger picture. Now, whichever of those your association falls into with regards to why you're conducting research, any research that you conduct has to be sound. It has to be designed effectively, executed effectively, analyzed and interpreted effectively. And that's what we'll be discussing today. So I'd like you, at the end of this webinar, to come away with 4 big takeaways. The first, now, associations are shifting away from gut and intuition-driven decisions based on internal myths, the Bigfoot that we see on this slide, perpetuated beliefs, and invalidated member perceptions, reacting to the squeaky wheels in your organization. As they move away from those gut decisions, they're moving more towards data-driven decisions, where they're really collecting the true voice of the member, a reflective and representative read on what your members' needs really are. Now, over the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen an emergence of low-cost or free survey instruments, making it easier than ever to learn and utilize those tools, and as a result, data is more accessible than ever. In fact, we describe it as a fire hose of information. We've been hit by a fire hose of data in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, even though that information and that data is more accessible than ever, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's good data, good information. Is the data that you're collecting reflective and representative of your entire membership? Is it answering the key business questions that you have in the right way? Is it getting your association actionable information? So as we think about the outcome of today, our goal is to give you tips, tricks, best practices on conducting effective research for making more well-informed strategic and tactical decisions within your association. In terms of an agenda for today's discussion, we'll give you a brief background on who we are at the Loyalty Research Center. As Kristen said, we'll describe why you should be a bit more diligent in terms of picking the most appropriate survey methodology for your membership and the types of business questions you're trying to answer. We'll describe 3 ways in which you can design a more effective action-oriented survey, creating a positive survey experience for your members, and then we'll wrap it up with questions and discussion. So who are we at the Loyalty Research Center? Well, we are a research and consulting firm based in Indianapolis, Indiana, and our clients come to us with a desire for information and insights into the relationships that they have with their constituents. And we work with, obviously, associations, but also in the corporate world and other nonprofit organizations as well. And we help our clients better understand the relationships that they have with those constituents, in this case, with members. What is the distribution of relationships that exist? And what percentage of your members are strongly engaged, moderately engaged, weakly engaged? Why do those relationships exist? Why do you tend to have stronger, more engaging relationships with some members, or even weak or disengaged relationships with others? And finally, what can you do with that? If you can identify what the critical needs are of your membership, how do you prioritize those needs most effectively to move the needle on those member relationships? How do you get the biggest bang for your buck when you're making an investment in the future of your membership and their level of engagement with you? That's what we do for our clients. And what sets us apart from others in the industry? Well, we have a singular focus on the linkage between the relationships that you have with your members, your employees, your industry partners, your affiliates, and the behaviors that result from those relationships. And we'll talk more about that throughout the course of the presentation today. We have a very sophisticated analytic toolkit to help you get the most out of the information you're collecting from your members. Deeper insights, more comprehensive insights. And when we think about the market research spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, you tend to find just the data collectors, call centers, survey tools that simply collect the information for you, and then it's up to you to analyze it and interpret it. On the other end of the spectrum, you have consultants who use research as a tool. We tend to fall somewhere in the middle, a little bit further to the right, where it's the consulting relationship. So we have research methodologists here on staff, so we understand the science of research, which is what we'll be talking about today, but we also work very closely with our clients to help them understand what information could you expect on the back end? How do you use that information? And then ultimately work with your organization on how do you implement change? How do you make that change occur within your organization? And then down below you see a sample of our clients both in the for-profit and nonprofit world. Now we break our solution suite into 4 main categories. Typically our engagements with our clients start with an engagement assessment program, member engagement analysis and segmentation. It may also include a prospective member analysis, a lapsed member analysis, and even some of our association clients choose to do an employee engagement survey. But beyond that point, if you think of the relationship assessment as a hub of a wheel, off of that there are spokes where in any research that you conduct, there are likely going to be additional questions that come up. And as I said on the previous slide, we have the toolkit to help you answer those questions. Whether it's better understanding the environment that your members are working in on a daily basis, whether it's digging deeper into some specific member experiences or more solution-oriented follow-ups, or it's looking at the data that you've collected historically and trying to make more sense of it, whether that's appending it to survey research that we do or looking at it independently on an island. So that's who we are and what we do at the Loyalty Research Center. Now, the first objective for today's webinar was to help you better pick the most appropriate methodology for the research you're looking to conduct. You know, it's far too easy to just say, what's the cheapest and easiest way to collect the information that we're looking for? When in fact, before you even get into an RFP process, you need to be thinking about what is the information that we're looking to collect and what are the factors that are most important to us. So whether it's a paper survey, a phone survey, a web-based survey, or as we'll talk about the next iteration of research being mobile surveys, the four factors that we typically look at are design and implementation, member participation, the quality of the information that you'll receive, and the cost. Now, the handout that Kristen alluded to in the introduction actually will take this slide and give you a bit more detail. What I'm going to be looking at is when I compare each of these methodologies, which are good, which are better, and what is the best methodology in terms of these four factors. If we start with paper, and yes, there are still associations out there that are collecting research via paper surveys. The first piece that we look at is design and implementation. You know, paper surveys are very easy to design. You can do it in a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. They can be easy to collect. It's mailing a survey out or taking that survey with you to a conference, a meeting, event, an education session perhaps, handing them out and collecting them at the end. The challenge from an implementation standpoint, however, is if you're mailing them out, how easy or difficult might that be? But also on the back end, when the surveys are returned to you, whether they're mailed out and they come back or you hand them out at a conference, event, or education session, the data entry can be very time-consuming, very time-intensive. So that chews up a lot of staff time entering what could be dozens or even hundreds, maybe even thousands of paper surveys, depending on the scope of the research. So that's why we say it's better. In terms of member participation, paper surveys are really only good at getting the participation that you look for. Paper surveys, as you might expect, miss key demographics. Younger members, members that maybe don't check mail or don't want to fill out a particular survey. It's not necessarily generationally driven. Participation can also be impacted by the fact that you may be using a convenience form of sampling your membership. As an example, let's say you're trying to conduct research at a conference. Well, that's a captured audience. That's a captured group. But if you're asking questions about their overall satisfaction or their overall engagement or loyalty to the organization, you're inherently putting a bias into the results by conveniently sampling them at an event where you would expect your most engaged members would be attending. So that convenient sampling can hurt you from a participation standpoint, but also an information quality standpoint. The other challenge with information quality is you have little to no control over the responses that are ultimately sent back to you. You know, our favorite example is coloring outside the lines. You give them a nice 5-point scale to work with, and rather than just circling the 4 or the 5, you have those members that draw the arrow in and write 4.5. Well, what are we supposed to do with that? How are we supposed to handle that? Do we assume that we can round it up to a 5? Well, no, then why didn't they just circle 5? Well, maybe we should circle it as a 4. Well, there's something better than a 4 that they're thinking about. So it creates all kinds of issues in terms of quality of information. In addition to that, you have incomplete or invalid information. If members don't want to answer a particular question, they don't have to. There's nothing that's forcing them to, making it a required question. In fact, they may even be answering questions that you don't intend for them to answer because they don't qualify or they should have skipped over that question. So information quality can be challenging. Ultimately, the cost effectiveness of a paper survey is only good. Because of the time-consuming effort, if you're planning on mailing surveys out, it's not only the printing cost, but the outbound postage and inbound postage costs, and then balancing that with the quality of the information and the participation you get, the value is probably the least value in each of the methodologies here today. In terms of phone surveys, the design and implementation is most difficult of the mix of methodologies here because it typically, in order to do it, you require more professional help to design and implement it. In an easy 5-question survey, the design and implementation would probably get 3 stars. But if you're thinking about strategy and a more comprehensive or complex survey, you're going to have to take into account logic, skipping over questions if they don't qualify or don't have experience. You want someone to write the survey questions in a manner that is conversational over the phone. In terms of design and implementation, it simply takes longer to collect the information. Imagine a membership base of 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 members. You're trying to get as many members on the phone as possible. Well, not everyone is going to be at their desk or at their home when you're contacting them. And even if you do reach them, it may not be a convenient time for a 10 or 15 or 20-minute survey. So you'll have to schedule time. And then with a limited number of interviewers, the amount of time to collect that information just tends to be longer. Member participation is better for a phone survey. It works very well for smaller. A general rule of thumb that we use is if you have less than 1,000 members, paper surveys and web-based surveys may not get you the participation that results in a statistically valid read on your membership. So we typically recommend phone surveys for smaller memberships, but it does, like the paper survey, miss key demographics. Who are the cord cutters in your membership? It's not necessarily a generational issue anymore. In fact, whether you're Gen Y or millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, even some of your traditionalists are getting rid of landlines in favor of mobile devices. That makes it a challenge to complete telephone surveys. The information quality is the best when you're comparing phone to any of the other methodologies. It collects the true and full voice of the member. So whereas with a paper survey, you're limited to really whatever they choose to answer, with a phone survey, you ensure that they're answering all of the questions that they should be answering. But beyond that, think of an open-ended question. You get a one-word answer. What phone interviewers are going to do is to probe more deeply into why do you say that? Or could you be more specific? Or could you clarify your response? Give me an example. It allows you to get much richer information on the back end. It also gives you the most control over your responses. We look at the cost effectiveness when you factor in that you may need professional help to design and implement. The cost of completing hundreds or maybe thousands of phone surveys, the data collection costs are going to be relatively high. But the information you get back is going to be the best of the 3 methodologies. So you really have to balance the hard cost of acquiring that information with the quality of the information you get back. The web-based surveys, this is what I was alluding to in the key takeaway slide at the outset. There are a number of survey tools out there now that make it very easy to design surveys, to collect the information, whether it's the fact that they can distribute the surveys out to an email list that you provide, or you do it through a survey link that you generate. You post it on social media, you post it on your website. So it's very easy to collect the information with a web-based survey. And a lot of these tools now offer very basic analysis and reporting functions so that you can look at what are the insights that can be gleaned from the information we're collecting. So in regards to design and implementation, web surveys are actually the best. In terms of member participation, a web survey, because it's sent out through social media, through a website, or through email distribution, is basically free. So it allows for a true census-based approach to sampling. It gives every member with an email address or access to the website or social media an opportunity to participate, which increases the total number of participation, but it tends to result in lower participation rates than the other 2 methodologies. Generally speaking, a paper survey maybe generates a 20% response rate. A phone survey 50 or 60% participation, and this is in general. Now, web survey, we have seen participation rates on average between 8 and 12%. The key, however, is not so much in the 8 to 12%. 8 to 12% of 100 members is a concern. 8 to 12% of 1,000 members, or 10,000 members, or 20,000 members, all of a sudden the participation rate is not necessarily the concern. You have the statistically valid read that you need. You have the confidence that you need in the results. The bigger concern at that point is how reflective or representative those completes are, that 8 to 12% is of your overall membership population. So that's what we look at in terms of participation, is not just the quantity of the completes, but also the quality of the completes. Web-based surveys allow for longer surveys. The functionality typically offers for a save and continue later feature. You have more control over the information. You can build in logic to skip individuals over questions that don't apply. You can make questions required if you want to force an answer. And the information that you get back tends to be most representative of your overall membership population. We have fewer concerns about missing key demographics with web-based surveys than we do phone and paper. As a result, from a cost and a value standpoint, web surveys can be the least expensive to manage and can arguably give you the most value in terms of the information you get in return. Now, the next iteration of data collection, I'm not going to call it the next generation, but the next iteration of data collection is mobile. Now, mobile offers us a lot of exciting opportunities for collecting information from members, customers, employees. It's better at targeting hard-to-reach demographics and on-the-go members. Everyone has a mobile phone. Even if I don't work a desk job or I'm out of the office, I travel a lot for business, I can reach those individuals. Data collection is quicker. We don't have to wait for someone to open email or to respond to a phone call or to receive the paper survey. It's at their fingertips. It's on demand. One of the more exciting pieces about mobile data collection is the ability to geolocate or geofence. So let's say that you have a particularly challenging time with a geographic region of members. Say it's the Midwest, us Midwesterners, or we have that hospitality, but maybe we're just simply not as engaged as you would expect us to be. Well, mobile research enables you to fence individuals within zip codes or using GPS coordinates to say, we want to talk to that particular audience. We want to push the survey to those individuals. Or maybe a more applicable experience. You collect an annual conference survey after the fact, but you'd like to know about a particular keynote speaker. Where mobile data collection is going is that you could geofence a particular seminar, a particular ballroom, a particular presentation. And while those individuals are captured in that conference room, ask them some questions. Poll them on their mobile phone while they're there. It offers a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity. The technology is there and it's getting better every single day. The challenge, however, is that as we saw with telephone, landlines, there are increasingly tighter and tougher rules and regulations on soliciting, whether it's, we don't consider research solicitation, but by the letter of the law, some instances of that, it is solicitation. So we have to be very careful about who we push those out to, being sensitive to when we're pushing them out, how we're pushing them out, the kind of information we're collecting. We just have to be sensitive to those rules and regulations. But all of these factors go into a very critical decision point in your member research, picking the most appropriate methodologies. Now, the second big takeaway that we have is in designing an effective action-oriented survey. When I mentioned at the outset that strategy tends to mean strategic planning, or it tends to mean something very specific related to the member experience, a lot of times our clients are looking for a temperature check on their membership. Member satisfaction is a phrase that's thrown out a lot. We do member engagement or member loyalty for a couple of key reasons. member satisfaction tends to only be attitudinal in nature, whereas member engagement combines both attitudes and behaviors. Member satisfaction tends to be more of a happiness index, if you will, whereas member engagement tends to give you more of a realistic measure of those actual relationships. Let me give you an example. We've started working with an association over the last 12 to 18 months, or in fact we have worked with them over the last 12 to 18 months, measuring the relationships that they have. Historically, they've looked at satisfaction. Since the late 90s, right around 2000, they had seen member satisfaction increase from around 60% to in excess of 90%. To be specific, 92% member satisfaction. But they weren't convinced that 90% of their members were engaged. Now, over the same period of time, they had seen flat annual meeting attendance, advocacy, which was a critical part of their value proposition. Grassroots advocacy efforts were non-existent at the state and local level. And they had had challenges in backfilling their aging and retiring membership base, as well as leadership positions with newer, younger members. So in fact, whereas 90% of their members were satisfied, only about 40% of their members were strongly engaged with them. That's a huge disconnect in terms of strategy, in terms of planning, in terms of what do we do with these members. You know, it's always nice from an advertising standpoint or a promotional standpoint to say 95% of our members are satisfied. But as you see revenue declining, as you see involvement declining, it really makes you question whether that's a realistic measure of your member relationships. Satisfaction is not member engagement. So that's the first piece. When it comes to designing a more effective strategy, you need a more realistic measure of your member relationships. Why measure member engagement? Well, relationships are critical to your success, the growth of your association. What we have found historically is that members that have stronger relationships with your association consider renewal to be an automatic decision. It's more predictable. 90% of members are extremely or very likely to renew their membership next year. That tends to translate into around 90% retention every year. That ensures a thriving and committed member base over the long term. These members also not only say that they're likely to speak positively or recommend membership, but they're actually out there doing it for you. They are your advocates. They are your ambassadors. They are your evangelists. They're recommending that people join this organization. They're referring other individuals into the organization. So they're single-handedly growing your membership. They attend meetings. They go to events on a regular basis. They purchase fee-based products and services. What is the implication of that? Well, it drives up your non-due revenue. It actually makes your non-dues revenue more predictable. Now, the dues revenue, if we know we're retaining 90% of our members every year, we know the implication on our budget. But when we're going through tough economic times, non-dues revenue can be extremely volatile. With strongly engaged members, you know how many meetings they're attending, how many meetings out of the last 5 years does a strongly engaged member attend, what products do they buy, how often do they participate in education, do they donate to a PAC fund or our advocacy effort, do they give to our foundation. All of that becomes more predictable, more recurring in terms of non-dues revenue. And they establish themselves as leaders in the organization. Engaged members will typically start off by volunteering, getting their feet wet, dipping their toe in. They get involved in committees and task forces, and then ultimately they're bought in. They work their way up the association governance model. So those are 4 key behavioral characteristics of an engaged member and why it helps to grow and make your association more successful. You measure member engagement by distribution of relationships. What percentage of my members are strongly engaged, moderately engaged, weakly engaged? What are the needs that they have that are driving those relationships? So what is it that's creating stronger, more engaged relationships with some members, weaker or less engaged, maybe even disengaged relationships with others? And third, as you focus on the needs that are most critical to them, the drivers of member engagement, you can monitor and track how those relationships are changing over time. And as a result, you should be seeing those more favorable behaviors from your members. Now, we like to model things in the research world. Not model in terms of, I'm going to be wearing a new bathing suit for you today, but in terms of analytic modeling. And we look at the relationships that you have with your members, and we have to design a metric that explains those behaviors. To say a strongly engaged member tends to be more involved in your organization and tends to be a greater source of non-dues revenue. Whereas a weakly engaged member, less predictable non-dues revenue and are far less likely to be involved. So we show you the implication to changing those relationships over time. And then it's, what do we need to be focusing on as an organization? What are the aspects of our membership value proposition that are most critical to them? What are the drivers of member engagement? And then within each one of these, what are the expectations and requirements that our members have? If it's continuing education, what are the formats that they desire? What are the topics that are of interest to them? Do they want more regular or less frequent interaction with you in terms of education? Where else do they get their education? You really can drill into what are the specific needs that they have. And this is the way that you should be structuring a questionnaire as well. Starting off by getting an overall measure of the relationships, tying in some behavioral information, and then asking certain modules within your questionnaire that are specific to your member experience and all of the attributes that potentially contribute to that experience. So from a questionnaire design standpoint, having an appropriate flow to your survey. Now, the second piece is that stated importance rarely helps to establish priorities. And when you're thinking about strategy, focus and prioritization are probably two of the key words that you hear in your association. Well, by asking stated importance, what we tend to find is that everything is important to everyone. I'll give you another example. Over the last 2 years, we've worked with an association that was adamant about asking importance. So we put that question in there. And as you might expect, for the 9 areas that we measured importance on, for all 9 of them, 70% or more of their members said they were extremely or very important. Gosh, that doesn't give us a lot of discrimination between things that we should be prioritizing or focusing on. How do we use this information? Where should we be investing as an organization? I would be fearful in investing in something that's important to 80%, 90%, but leaving out something that's important to 70% of our members. Instead, we look at something called derived importance or driver analysis. And I promise you this will be as statistically heavy as we get today, but I wanted to just graphically show you what I mean by a driver, something that is a driver of engagement. These plot maps look at individual respondents and how they responded to a particular question. Let's say it's advocacy, and then ultimately their level of engagement with us. Now, something that is a strong driver of engagement, what you typically find is that your weakly engaged members rate you fair or poor in that area. Your moderately engaged members are in the middle of the spectrum or middle of the scale, and your strongly engaged members tend to rate you excellent or very good. So you get this very tight, directional flow to the respondents. It gives you, and this is the implication, how do we change relationships? Well, you do it by focusing on things that are strong drivers. It says that as you improve advocacy, as an example, you also have a higher probability of changing relationships. Whereas something that is a weak driver of engagement, it's far more random. Let's say this is communication. Well, for communication, our weakly engaged members, some of them like it, Some of them don't like it. Moderately engaged is the same way. Strongly engaged is the same way. It really doesn't give you any evidence to suggest that improving communication is going to do anything to change relationships. And these are the areas that as an organization, when you're thinking about strategy and planning, you should be focusing on. Focus on the things that explain engagement, not those that don't. So let's go back to that previous example with importance. Here are your importance ratings. Instead of focusing on the important, let's focus on the things that ultimately emerged as drivers of engagement. Well, for one, there are only 4 of them that have a strong or a moderate impact. The others are weak. So it suggests that these are the 4 areas that most discriminate strongly engaged from weakly engaged. Now let's compare this to our importance ratings. Well, we checked one. 87% of members felt that the annual meeting is an important benefit to them, and it did emerge as a strong driver. So in that case, we were in line. It was a validation point. But for networking events, it was one of the least important in quotations there. But it emerged also as a strong driver because we would bet that the 20% of members that said you were fair or poor tend to be your weakly engaged members. Those that say you're excellent or very good, probably your strongly engaged members. So while it's not important to as many members as the annual meeting, this offers an opportunity for changing those relationships. So stated importance does not necessarily give you the prioritization you're looking for. I'll give you another example. Let's use this to say if we were to have focused on advocacy, 86% of our members said it was important, or a member technology tool, and 85% of our members said it was important. And we invested a lot of resource in that over about a 2 or 3 year period. And we resurveyed our members, and the relationships haven't changed. We were focusing on the wrong areas. Rather than focusing on the things that are important, focus on the things that explain the relationships. Another way of looking at this, something that resonates really well with management teams and boards of directors, is to visualize what are our opportunities. So we look at, in the vertical axis, the impact on engagement. Things that have a strong or a moderate impact are above the equator here, and things that have a weak or an insignificant impact are down below. We also look at performance benchmarks. Generally speaking, in the association world, 60% excellent, very good on a 5-point scale tends to be a healthy target. So we say anything above 60% that is significant is a strength to leverage. Anything that is in this case, a moderate driver, but falls below the benchmark is an opportunity for improvement. Something that scores below the benchmark but is a weak or insignificant driver is what we call a low return on investment opportunity. We can pump a lot more resource into the website, but it doesn't necessarily impact engagement. So this would be an area that you would not expect to see a change in relationships if you're investing in. And then finally, our maintained performance category are things we're doing very well, it just doesn't have an impact. By investing a lot more resource to try to move 74% for our newsletter up to, say, 80 or 90%, that's not really going to lift your relationships any further. However, the one caveat that I tend to place on this quadrant is for something like customer or member service. Oh, great, 70% of our members think we're doing a tremendous job in customer member service. Thank goodness we can take our foot off the pedal. That's been a key priority for us over the last couple of years. So we're going to go from 4 customer service staff to 3. Well, all of a sudden, members start recognizing or acknowledging that their hold times are longer, or it's taking you longer to pick up their call because of the call volume. Your responsiveness is less. It's weaker. It's lower. All of a sudden, this relative strength, this maintained performance category, they notice the decrease in quality, and all of a sudden it becomes significant in their minds. By taking resource away from that area, all of a sudden you've made a maintained performance area into an opportunity for improvement. So that's the one caveat. Don't just assume because we're doing well and it doesn't have an impact that it can't have an impact in the future. The third piece is protecting and maximizing your survey real estate. One of the biggest challenges that we see in the research world, not only for associations, but also in the corporate world as well. Asking 40 minutes of questions in a 20-minute survey. So rather than focusing on, or as you're thinking about survey length, consider questions that you may be asking that you don't need to ask. You already know the answer to. Let me give you an example. For a number of our associations clients, they love to ask demographic questions, and it's 10 to 15 questions out of a 40-question survey. But you already know the answers to those demographics because you collect them on your membership application or you update them on a regular basis. You have them in your contact database, your CRM, or your association management system. Instead of asking those questions in your survey, embed a unique ID in your web survey link or tie a member ID to each phone interview that's conducted or each paper survey that goes out so that on the back end you can connect it to that existing demographic or descriptive data. Get you more for less. Don't ask questions that you may already know the answer to. That frees up some of that extremely valuable survey real estate to ask questions that are going to better help you drive change in your organization, better help you answer the key business questions that you have. Now, the last topic that I have for you today is creating a positive survey experience. Now, we have seen over the last 10 to even 15 years, participation rates have plummeted. As I mentioned, for a typical web survey, 8 to 12% is average. Well, in part, that's been the fact that we've been bombarded by the number of surveys and communications that go out to us via email. But even in phone surveys, even in paper surveys, methodologies change to try to maximize participation rates, when in fact, part of the challenge is actually poor design and poor execution. So 3 tips for you today in terms of creating a positive survey experience for your members. Ways that you could increase your participation rates. First, pre-notify the members that you select to participate in a survey. Why are you conducting this research? What are the questions that you're trying to answer? What kind of information are you trying to collect for them? And how are you going to use it? Is it part of a strategic planning exercise? Tell them that. Are you trying to make improvements in the value proposition? Tell them that. Give them a reason to participate. Your members are a member for a reason. They're here to support your organization and support your profession. They'll participate if they know what the benefit to them participating really is. So pre-notify them with that. Tell them who it's going to be coming from so that they can look out for it. Tell them when the survey is going to launch and how much time they have to complete it. And tell them how long it will take them to complete the survey. And that's the second best practice. Please, 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 please be honest about your survey length. Please do not tell your members that it is a brief survey when it's going to take them 20 or 30 minutes to complete. One of the worst things that you can do in survey design is be untruthful, if you will, about your survey length. If it's going to take 20 minutes, tell them it's going to take approximately 20 minutes. You have the functionality at your disposal with a lot of these web survey tools to allow them to save and continue later, to pick up at a time that's more convenient for them. The frustration that I hear from members that say, you told me this was going to be a 10-minute survey, and it took me 20 minutes. It took me 25 minutes. It took me 30 minutes. Or we hear our clients that say, well, it's a brief survey, and it's 55 questions. Now, we all know that that's not a brief survey. Be honest about your survey length. It'll help your participation rate in the long run. And then finally, be disciplined about the number of surveys that you send out. As I mentioned at the outset, that fire hose effect. Given that it's relatively cheap or even free to do so, it's very easy just to build a survey and send it out to your membership on a whim. But as participation rates have declined, we have been challenging our association clients to think about who they're sending their surveys to, setting up a limit on the number of surveys that your members as a whole can receive in a given year, or that certain members, maybe member segments, receive on an annual, quarterly, or monthly basis. Now, as we saw open rates declining for email, most associations now have a communication calendar in their organization that limits the amount of communication, that it's signed off on by someone in the organization. And we're not sending 5, 10, 15 emails out on the same day. You can develop a very similar strategy for your member research in order to keep that participation rate high over the long term. The other piece is, think about who your target audience is. If you're interested in collecting information from millennials, don't send the survey to your entire membership and then screen 75% of them out on the first question, an age question. Be more diligent about thinking about the purpose of the research and who the research should be targeting. All of these things will help you create a more positive survey experience for your members. So let's take a step back and reflect on what we've talked about over the last 45 minutes or so. More effective membership strategies start with better, stronger member research. Stronger member research means, first and foremost, picking the most appropriate survey methodology, the one that can best answer the questions that you're asking your members, the one that may not necessarily be the cheapest, but gives you the best information. It's designing an effective, action-oriented survey. If member relationships are a critical part of your strategy, which I would assume they are, make sure you're getting a realistic measure of those relationships. When you're thinking about focus and prioritization for your strategic planning, don't just assume that what your members tell you is important is actually what's critical to them in terms of their needs, their expectations, what's really driving their engagement. And third, don't ask questions you may already know the answer to. It'll save you on your survey real estate and give you more room for asking more critical questions. And stronger member research also means creating a positive survey experience for your members to maximize your participation rate. Once you have a well-designed, well-executed survey that gives you results that are representative and statistically valid, then you can start taking action on the information. Then you can start planning your strategy going forward. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions or discussion that anyone has. Kristen, I'll hand it over to you for any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, they can go ahead and type them into the chat box, and Matt will answer the question for you. We do have some questions that are submitted, and I'll read this one off. When you have a large portion of your membership who is over 60, is mobile really an option with that demographic?
Good question. So it depends on what the questions are that you're trying to answer, what your strategy is. If you're thinking about 5 or 10 years down the road and that membership may not be as relevant to you as your younger members, you may say that while it'd be nice to get their feedback in the research, who you really want to hear from are the up-and-coming members. So in that instance, mobile could work very well for your target audience. Again, it's knowing the question that you're trying to answer, what you're trying to do with the information, and who the most appropriate audience is for those questions and for that information. We deal with, in the association world, most associations are facing this challenge. You certainly don't want to alienate that demographic by not giving them the opportunity to participate. But if it means getting participation from a hard-to-reach audience, mobile may be a good option for you.
Okay, we have another question. How does one determine an engaged member from a non-engaged member? Is that from certain questions in the questionnaire?
Yes, so the way that we design our engagement metric, it is not a one-question metric. It's not a one-question solution. We look at 3 key factors. We look at the overall value that they derive from your membership, so what they pay compared to what they get in return. We look at their likelihood to speak positively or recommend your organization, and we look at their likelihood to renew their membership the next time it comes due. The combination of responses to those 3 questions will tell you whether the members are strongly engaged, moderately engaged, or weakly engaged. The second step in that, though, just as a caveat, is comparing that distribution of relationships or the relationship classifications to actual behaviors. If it doesn't show discrimination in behaviors, it's probably not a good metric. There may be other things going on in your membership. As an example, if you have a lot of competition, you may want to consider asking a relative value question, comparing your organization's value to a benchmark organization's value. You may want to ask a relative recommend or a relative renew. You may ask different questions entirely. But generally speaking, we look at value, recommend, and renew as the 3 questions to help most organizations determine their level of engagement.
Okay, and we have another question. How do you tie the results from an anonymous survey to the indicators of engagement?
How do we tie the anonymous surveys to measures of engagement? I'm going to take a stab at that question. It may require some follow-up on the back end. So with our surveys, the beauty of using a third party for research is that we can guarantee that anonymity. So we can build in a unique ID that ties that database information to their responses in the survey. We also always recommend at the end of your survey asking them, would you be all right if your responses were shared with the association? Most of the time when an individual gets through a survey and they see that it's relatively tame, there's nothing too sensitive in it, they're willing to waive that anonymity or that confidentiality. So ask a question, yes, no, or no preference, to make sure that they could waive that anonymity. But the big thing would be tying a unique ID to a survey, connecting it back to that data on the back end.
Great. And that looks like that's all the questions that we've received at this point. Matt, if you would want to share any concluding remarks?
No, I very much appreciate everyone attending the webinar today. I hope that you've taken something away from this. Our goal in doing a webinar like this is to give you tools, tips, tricks, so that you can take some of this information and begin using it in your day-to-day work, whether you're actually working on a strategic plan right now, you're planning to this year. Research will likely play a role in developing that strategic plan. So I hope that you take something, at least one thing away from the webinar today that you can begin implementing in your next strategic planning or action planning effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, for your wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it, and I'd like to thank all of the guests for joining us this afternoon. We'll be sending you a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording if you're interested in sharing it with colleagues or watching again. And for those of you that indicated that you'd like Matt to send you the presentation, the PowerPoint PDF, you'll be receiving that shortly as well. 123 Sign-Up has more webinars in the pipeline, so please stay tuned for that. And to learn more about 123 Sign-Up software, please visit 123signup.com. You can request a free personalized demo at any time. And the software is really ideal for organizations of all kinds and sizes. You can collect membership enrollments and renewals online, design event registration pages, and create post-event surveys, just to name a few functions, which really makes running your association a lot easier. If you have any questions regarding the software or today's webinar, you can also contact us at info@123signup.com. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar. Have a great day, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, Matt.